And welcome back to the channel. In this week's lecture, we're going to do some more calculating when we're going to take a main prescription and learn how to calculate the near vision prescription as well as the intermediate vision prescription. Hey, Sean here from modernoptician.com, where we help student opticians achieve their goals through books, study guides, and online videos just like this one. And before we jump into today's video, just a quick reminder that the Modern Optician contact lens study guide has just dropped, so make sure to check it out at modernoptician.com. If you're studying for your NCLE exam or the NACOR contact lens portion, this is definitely something you want to check out. All right, enough said. Let's jump into our presentation about calculating near and intermediate RXs. All right, here we go. Calculating near and intermediate prescriptions. Definitely a skill that every optician should have at their disposal. Most prescriptions are written in standard notation with the distance prescription plus the ad, and sometimes the refractionists, the optometrists will write the desired reading or intermediate prescriptions. Other times they won't. So you need to be able to calculate it. A pretty simple process. We're going to talk about both the near prescription as well as the intermediate prescription, and a couple little tricks and concepts that you need to keep in the back of your mind while you're doing this. So let's jump right into it. All right, as you know by now, I like to jump into the why before we jump into the how, and this is no different. So let's take a look at a few things. So presbyopes will require different power for different working distances because those different working distances involve different focal lengths. And as we know from all our studying so far, depending on the focal length, it will have a different dioptric demand. Now, the prescription will normally be written in standard notation, which involves the distance portion and the ad. Sometimes the optometrist or refractionist will write a specific prescription based on what they measured for a specific distance, but not always, and actually not usually. So you need to be able to calculate these things, and the reading Rx or intermediate Rx must therefore be extrapolated or calculated using equations or simple concepts that we will cover in this lecture. Important to realize that not every patient will desire or adapt to a multifocal option, because you might be thinking, well, if I fit them with a progressive, all the different focal lengths should be taken care of. However, not everybody does well with that, and that's not always the best option, because as a matter of fact, single vision task-specific eyewear is often, and I think usually, the best option. Progressive lenses, multifocal options like flat tops or flat top trifocals, these are all options, however, at a significant compromise. The only convenience factor being that it's one pair that does it all, but doesn't always do it well. Therefore, calculating task-specific eyewear is definitely a skill that an optician should possess and should really help their patients out with it. So why don't we jump into how to calculate these different powers and how to implement them. Now, before we jump into the exact calculations that we're going to be doing, which is pretty much the easy part, we need to understand some of the conventions, which is a little bit more of the not the complicated part, but just the part that allows you to really understand what's going on. And sometimes and often it is missed, and that's where errors get made, errors in judgment, particularly as far as how to correct particular prescriptions. So the ad power on the prescription refers to the amount of power necessary to assist accommodation. Now you got to keep in mind, we talked about this in previous lectures on presbyopia, where as the amplitude of accommodation decreases over a person's life, the crystalline lens is able to contribute less and less power. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it can't contribute any power. It just means that it's a little bit compromised. So as presbyopia advances, the ad power increases and increases more and more. But an early presbyope might only have an addition of 0.75 diopters or 1 diopter. That doesn't change the dioptric demand of the focal length of what they're trying to look at, let's say for a near object. All it's changing is the amount of focal power being contributed by the crystalline lens. Very important concept to keep in mind. So it's also important to realize that most prescriptions will be written, the ad power and whatever reading prescriptions are done are usually done at 40 centimeters unless otherwise specified. 40 centimeters works out to about 16 inches to those working in the imperial world. However, most of eye care is done in metric, so we should probably stick to that. 2.5 diopters of converging power articulates perfectly to 40 centimeters, and that is based on our focal length equation here in the corner, which I will select my pen. The focal power is the reciprocal of the focal length. So if you were to divide 1 by 40, you end up with 2.5, and that's how you know what the dioptric demand of that focal distance is. And like I just mentioned, 2.5 diopter add infers that no accommodation is helping out. So if you have a patient with a 2.5 diopter addition, you know that accommodation is dead in the water. And you will see here, this table right here kind of gives you a bit of an understanding of what the different focal powers are appropriate to a particular focal length. And you'll notice here that we just mentioned 2.5 corresponds to 0.4 meters, which is 40 centimeters. And over in this table, we see the approximate near addition values relative to patient's age. This is not set in stone. Every single patient will progress through presbyopia at a different rate. However, for the most part, this rings pretty true for most patients, that around the age of 45, they will end up with about a +1 addition, and then from 50 to 55, +150 to 2, and it moves on going as you get older to the point where you're 75. Accommodation should be more or less disabled, actually around 70 as well, and you end up with a 250 addition. Very important to realize that even though some of these younger patients only need, let's say at 55, only need a 2, the dioptric demand of a 40 centimeter near point convergence is still going to be 2.5 diopters, but that means that plus 0.5 is still being done by the accommodative ability of the eye, which is why the addition is lower in that particular case, because accommodation is still intact. Anything less, accommodation is helping out, and that applies for absolutely every single age group. Under 45, pre-presbyopic, they're getting the full accommodative power from the crystalline lens, so it's not an issue, but every year after 40, it starts to be an issue. And anything higher than 2, you notice that we didn't go any higher here than a plus 270, 250, so a 275, 3 plus 3, even sometimes you'll see a plus 325. These are usually due to lower visual performance, either it be from optical media, opacities such as cataracts or anything like that, or some form of low vision problem. This is not going to correlate, or in the case, I was going to say it isn't going to correlate to focal length, or unless the patient has a very near demand, less than 40 centimeters. In that case, I would translate to a higher addition power. However, in most cases, if you see a higher addition, it means that person's struggling. You normally see very elderly people with higher additions. Usually what we're trying to achieve here is more magnification, or trying to fight through some kind of pathology, whether it be retinal disease or cataracts or things like that, just trying to give them a little bit more magnification and clarity in order to aid with low vision. So why don't we jump into actually calculating all this stuff now that we understand the conventions. And before we jump into actually calculating a few examples, let's jump into looking at the exact kind of equations that we're going to use. And I still want to refer to that table that we talked about with the focal power versus focal length. You will notice here that in the reading realm, I mentioned that we tend to deal in 40 centimeters away as the standard convention, which would represent a 2.5 addition. Anything less, again, remember, it is just being helped out by accommodation. Nonetheless, you will be using the add power, regardless of what that is. You'll be using the add power that's prescribed, and you're going to add it to the sphere. This will then give you the new sphere. Now, the astigmatism and its orientation does not change whether you're looking in the distance or near. We've talked about this. The problems with accommodation and presbyopia, and the reason why you have an add power, is only really applicable to the overall sphere power, whether the person's myopic or hyperopic. The astigmatism remains intact everywhere you look. Therefore, once you have your new sphere, you can then carry over the cylinder and axis as is intact, and you now end up with your reading prescription. Now, on the other side, if we're dealing with an intermediate prescription, there's a little bit of confusion out there for a lot of students when it comes to the intermediate prescription. And I've heard people say, well, you just take half the ad. Well, that's not always appropriate because half the ad, it does correlate pretty well for a higher edition, but when you get lower editions, half the ad just isn't going to cut it. What you have to think of when you think of the same way you were thinking of reading prescription, when you think of the intermediate RX, you have to think of what focal length are we dealing in. So for most cases, the average or the usual focal lengths that we deal in for intermediate would be somewhere in this kind of range. And I've kind of gone over about 3 different values here because it's not an exact science. It really depends on the task. It depends on the individual. I like to think of it more like a 1 meter. 1 meter seems to be a pretty standard refractive or like a focal distance for computer work, for playing an instrument, different things like that. However, these things can vary depending on the task, and you'll notice that the focal power is very much a function of the focal length in that 1 over f, like we talked about. But it correlates very intuitively to a 1 meter distance here will correlate to about a 1 diopter demand. And I accidentally covered that, so we're going to erase it. But a 0.8 meter correlates to a 125, and a 0.67 correlates to a 150. So the closer things get, the more dioptric power you require, which is very much in line with all the other stuff we've been talking about refraction. So you kind of have to decide where you're going to go as far as how much dioptric power is going to be necessary for that intermediate prescription. Now, in our case here, I like to use an ad of 1. I find that to be the softest, kind of easiest, gives you the more wiggle room, but you might find that you use different powers. A little bit of a tidbit of side information is that most task-specific progressive lenses use this idea. Whoops, sorry, I'm going to take that off. I didn't want to do that because we're going to need that later. It uses this concept of a digression, which we'll cover in a little bit more detail in the future. However, it's usually either a 1 digression or a 1.5 digression, which follows the exact same principle we just talked about. Okay, we've gone a bit of a tangent here, so let's jump back into the calculation. So again, using the exact same concept as we did in the reading prescription, you will simply add the intermediate ad to the sphere power and carry over the cylinder and axis the way you did. And then, like I said, your intermediate ad should fall somewhere between 1 and 150. Okay, so this is all the background stuff that we need to know to be able to actually apply this. Let's jump into the next slide and actually do the calculations. All right, so now that I've babbled about all the different conventions, different things that many of you probably already knew about, and I apologize if you already knew all that stuff. But again, like I mentioned in previous lectures, we need to go over this stuff just in case you didn't know and just in case you're starting out. Yeah, it's important to all of us. However, here are some examples. Let's apply the principles that we just talked about and see how it all works out. So in this first example, we're going to work on example 1 here. Here we have a prescription that is pretty standard stuff, and we're going to apply the principles by calculating the near prescription and then the intermediate prescription. So in this case, we have a 250 ad, which we can pretty much, if we want to talk about RX interpretation like we did in one of the previous lectures, we can assume that this person is probably quite presbyopic. They might be in their 60s or beyond, and they require this quite a bit in order to read and to do other work in kind of the near realm. So let's do the calculation just like we did. I'm not going to do all the mathing directly in front of you because I think this is pretty intuitive. So we just talked about how you're going to add the ad to the sphere right here. And let's just do that one eye at a time. So if we add 250 to a plus 0.5, we're going to end up with a plus 3. And again, we take the cylinder minus 1 times 145 and carry it over. Now, it doesn't get much easier than that in all the calculations we're going to do, and it really is that simple. So for the left eye, same thing. We take the 250 and we apply it here. So we're now going to end up with a plus 325. We take the cylinder and the axis and just carry it over. Minus 150 and 179. Perfect. Pretty simple stuff. So for the intermediate RX, we're going to do kind of the same thing, but in this case, we're actually only going to take a one ad uh, from this overall ad and do it in that way. So if we do the exact same concept, we're adding one to the sphere of each, you're going to end up with a plus 150. And the same thing, minus 1 times 145. The cylinder and the axis never go away. And we do the exact same thing here. We do plus 175 minus 150 at an axis of 179. There you go. You've got now have a near prescription and an intermediate prescription. If you wanted to apply this into a progressive lens and make your own task-specific progressive lens, you have to remember that you've taken one diopter from the ad here. In order to read things and actually end up with this prescription over here that we calculated, you would actually need to include an ad as well. So you've taken one diopter of the ad, and you can just keep a 150 ad here. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is basically your own task-specific progressive made all by yourself. I know there's a lot of products out there that do it all for you. However, you could very well just do this. And the beauty of this is you don't have to do it in a progressive. If you wanted to do it in a task-specific lined bifocal, like a flat top or things like that, this is how you would do this. So let's take a look at example number 2. You'll notice that we have a smaller ad here. So this person is less dependent on near correction than the person in the first example because their ad is lower. It's pretty intuitive. As soon as the ad is lower, you could assume that the person is probably younger and they are less dependent on correction because they still have more accommodative ability left in reserve. The other thing too that you're going to notice here, if we're going to talk about RX interpretation, is that this person is myopic. And they probably see pretty well up close with no correction. Sure, there's some astigmatism here in its compound, so they may not see perfect, but for the most part, you'll find that most patients in this with a prescription like this one don't complain too much about near vision. However, nonetheless, for the sake of argument, we are going to calculate this. So the same thing applies for the near prescription. We're going to add the plus 150 to the two sphere components. So in this particular case, we're going to end up with plano, and we carry over the cylinder and axis just like we did previously. And then we're going to end up with a plus 0.25 minus 1 times 120. So if you're kind of following along as far as like with the RX interpretation lecture we did a couple weeks ago and the same thing, you're going to look at this prescription and say like, wow, that's not really major. With the exception to the astigmatism, it's really not that strong. And if we did a spherical equivalent, this works out to being about a minus 0.5 and, a minus 0.25. So this is pretty basic stuff, especially for near. So like, I mean, in reality, they're not really going to be dependent on this. I wouldn't be surprised if a patient like this wouldn't even ask for reading glasses. However, and to each their own, some people do, and that's how you calculate it. So for the intermediate prescription, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take a 1 diopter correction. So we're gonna borrow some of this ad, and we're going to do the same thing. In this case, if we add the plus 1 to the sphere component, we're going to end up with a minus 0.5 minus 1. We're carrying over the cylinder and axis just like we've done in every example. And here we go, minus 0.25 minus 1 at 120. And that's your intermediate. And of course, if we're only borrowing a little bit of that ad, we actually end up with a 0.5 ad left over, which you'd be pretty hard pressed to find any multifocal with that level of ad manufacturing in it because it's so darn low. And again, this actual prescription is pretty basic stuff. However, they might, if a person spends a lot of time at the computer and different things, or if they're reading sheet music, and astigmatism tends to have a negative impact on reading font and especially things with characters, therefore they might feel that this would be beneficial to correct the intermediate prescription. So that's how you calculate these things, and this principle just keeps applying itself over and over again. Every single time you have to calculate a near prescription or an intermediate prescription, you do it in this way. One thing I want to mention before we finish this off is that, remember I said that sometimes people think you use half the ad? Well, if you were to use half for the intermediate, that is, if you were to use the half the ad over here of the 250, you would end up, let's say divided by 2, you'd end up with a plus 125, which isn't terribly different than what we're doing here. And if you were to use half the ad of this one, you would end up with a plus 0.75, which is basically just, the same amount off of the plus 1, and we use in both situations. So in reality, when we use this rule of using half the ad, it's not terrible in the sense that you end up with the same kind of answers or very, very similar prescriptions in the end. However, it is different enough that it could cause you problems, and it doesn't follow the principles that we just talked about in the previous slide about correlating focal length or focal distance with required dioptric demand and focal power. So always keep that in mind. You got to do things right, not just do it the simple and shortcut way. All right, so that does it for the presentation on calculating prescriptions for near and intermediate. This should give you all the tools necessary to do so. And this is one of the easiest calculations that you're going to do as an optician. And especially when you start to understand the nuances between the focal length and the dioptric demand, you can be a rock star at this pretty fast, and it's definitely something that you can calculate on your own really early on in your career. And we talk about low-hanging fruit here. We need to really master the simple concepts so that we can focus our time on the more complicated ones. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you got some value out of it and that you're better at calculating this stuff now. And I can't wait to see you in the next one. All right, I hope you enjoyed today's video. And always make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so that you get all the weekly content as it drops. And also make sure to check out modernoptician.com for books and study guides and all the help you need to pass your national examinations. I can't wait to see you in the next one.